Hi everyone, my name is Ian Majimpsey, and I am welcome to today's webinar on youth work, music production and measurement. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Birmingham's School of Education and co-convener of the BERA Youth and Informal Education Special Interest Group alongside Frances Howard, one of our speakers this afternoon. This is an exciting event for us today. This is our first event as a SIG since the pandemic put paid to our spring and summer plans, and it's our first session of two webinars this afternoon. And given that this is both an online and a free event, a special welcome to anyone who's not a BERA or a Youth SIG member or who might attend our things normally. If that's you, please do stay in touch with us. As I understand it, on the page that you can see, if you scroll to the bottom, not now, later, as you scroll to the bottom, you can click on a link to a page, to the SIG Special Interest Group page. I'll tell you a little bit more about us and how you might kind of stay in touch with us. So I hope you might do that. This event focuses on some really interesting and I think under-researched themes. We'll be looking at young people's practices of music production as distinct from music consumption or other related subcultural practices that perhaps get more attention in research. And we'll also be exploring music production as an educative process, specifically as a form of youth work. And that will give speakers the scope to give some critical consideration as to how the benefits of such work have been kind of quantified or reported, or the impact understood. Before we get started and introduce the speakers, just a couple of really quick things about how the session will run. We're aiming to be about 90 minutes. We'll finish at 2:30, I hope, and we have three speakers today. So each speaker will speak to us for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a short window for questions, for your questions before we hand over to the next speaker. Then at the end, when all three speakers have had their say, there'll be a longer window for further questions and some overall comments. So throughout the webinar, people's kind of mics and so on will be muted so we can hear the person speaking, but you can put your question through on the sidebar as you were kind of shown in a little introductory video if you caught that. I'll be able to see those questions and comments, and I'll put as many of those questions and comments as we can to the speakers, as I say, either just after they've spoken or at this sort of question and answer session at the end. So please do make the format as lively as we can by participating there. There's also going to be an interactive element to one of the speakers' presentations, a word cloud, and you'll be able to participate in that in the same kind of sidebar. So we have some great speakers with us today. Simon Glenister, who's the CEO of Noise Solution, which is a social enterprise engaging in youth work and focused on young people's music production and developing ways to understand the impact of those processes. We've got Frances Howard, who's a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University and is co-convener of the Youth SIG, Youth and Formal Education SIG at BERA with me, and Brian McShane, who is an assistant professor at Coventry University, who has a background in youth work and as a youth worker, and is now a sociologist in the criminology department at Coventry. So welcome to all, and without any further ado, I'll hand over to Simon as our first speaker.
Hello everybody, hi, how are you all doing? Thank you for inviting me along. Obviously it would have been nice if we'd all been in Liverpool as we originally intended, but that was not to be. I am going to speak to you for 20 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about the organisation, about the critical lens, theoretical lens that we use for the work that we do. I'm going to talk quite a lot about the use of digital in that work, and actually a lot of how the recent situation with the COVID pandemic has impacted on the development of that work. And I'm also going to talk about digital and how amazing it can be in terms of impact capture. Noise Solution has been around for 10 years now, and in the last 2 years, or for the last 2 years, it's been nominated as one of the UK's top 100 performing social enterprises, which is lovely. But a lot of that sort of recognition has been possible because of the work that we've done around impact capture and measurement, essentially. At its very, very core, essentially what we do is work with labelled youth, young people in lots of different challenging circumstances, often those who have histories of non-engagement with services for a whole bunch of reasons. And we pair them with a music producer, and we work on a mentoring program, one-to-one predominantly, that's informed by self-determination theory, which I'll talk about in a minute. And it's about creating a space where that young person feels that they're in control of what they're doing, making them feel good at something quickly and sharing that with the people around them. And we employ a digital platform that we've built with which to do that. But I think it's always nice to start with a bit of participant voice. So these are just a couple of messages from 3 young people that have worked with Noise Solution at various points. And these were collected independently as well. It wasn't a film we did, just so you know. And yeah, we'll just have a listen to what they've got to say.
My future was very bleak and I really had no real picture of how life could or should be.
Leaving the house was just impossible. I didn't want people to look at me or see me or talk to me.
I didn't even know if I'd make it to my future. And then Noise Solution came along and it was the best things of my life.
With the confidence I have now, I feel there is actually a future for me.
Without Noise Solution, I don't think I ever would have got into college. Definitely, it was one of the best experiences of my life.
Now, the reason I think that we get those kind of outcomes for young people who are formerly on very, very seriously negative trajectories was because we don't actually consider ourselves to be a music organisation at all. We use music as a tool, absolutely, but what we're actually focused on is how we impact on well-being. And there's a lot of white noise around well-being generally out in the world, not so much in academia, but certainly in the world. But we know unequivocally, if we can genuinely understand how to impact on well-being, that the outcomes around engagement, education outcomes, health outcomes, social outcomes, all these things improve markedly. And all that donkey work research has been done. We don't need to redo it. It's pretty much a given. So as an organisation, that's what we focus on, well-being. I recently completed a 2-year research master's under Pam Bernard, who I think is possibly watching. If you are watching, hi Pam, thank you very much. And the thing that popped out as being the most useful as somebody who was a practitioner researcher was self-determination theory as a framework with which to understand how to impact on motivation and well-being of young people who are often starting at a position of demotivation and amotivation. And how do we actually understand how we can move them along this scale and how do we generally impact on well-being so that we can get those outcomes around education and health and engagement. For those of you who don't know, SDT is arguably one of the world's most well-evidenced, empirically evidenced frameworks for understanding how to do that. It's had something like 350,000 Google Scholar citations in the last few years. DC and Ryan, who started it 30 years ago, have built it all around empirical evidence. And they've, I mean, I can't go into it in depth, obviously, because I've only got 20 minutes, but at a very, very, very sort of high level, sort of broad view, essentially they've identified 3 psychological needs that need to be focused on to shift people along that scale or spectrum of motivation and well-being. And we need to create spaces where young people feel that they have autonomous control, volition in what's going on around them. My background is as a youth worker in local authority teams where everything was about the deficits, and the subtext of so many of the conversations with young people in challenging circumstances was a professional coming into their world and going, well, you're rubbish at that, you're not doing that properly, I'm the expert, listen to me and we'll fix you, and you'll do this, this and this, and all autonomy was taken away. The other thing we need to do is create spaces where kids feel that they are competent, good at something, that they have something to offer quickly. Again, that same sense of competence was often undermined by this constant message of focusing on the problems in that kid's life rather than creating spaces where they were feeling they were good at something. And people need to feel connected and related to other people as well. There's so much great evidence coming out that the Co-op have been doing around the impacts around loneliness and how impactful that is. And it's really, really pertinent now, obviously, with the lockdown and sense of isolation and the impacts that that's having on young people. So it's a very, very, very broad, quick look at SDT, and we use SDT in all aspects of our work with Noise Solution. It runs through the whole organization. But the first bit that's most important is that when we pair that professional musician, that producer, with that young person, we enculture the staff to be autonomy supportive. So they start from a position not of coming in and saying we're going to do music at this young person. It's about finding out what their interests are, going to YouTube, you play me what you're into. I'm not going to pretend as the producer to be the expert in whatever your music is, but I have skills around using, you know, whatever music production we use, tools we use. And we can go on this learning journey together. And that's much more likely to engender engagement, because you are also often sidestepping those issues that you often have when a professional as a social worker or a teacher tries to engage with a young person as a position of authority. There are power imbalances there that are very, very problematic. So presenting as a musician is really, really great at sidestepping those issues. Pre-COVID, we would see them for 2 hours a week, and we'd start off in the home, and we'd take a laptop and some speakers and a MIDI keyboard and create there. Essentially, the use of music technology is pedagogically is about creating those quick wins with these young people. We've done a lot of work on that as well. So as well as using lots of loop-based production to get quick wins around whatever the genre of music is the young person is into, we've also developed a whole bunch of stuff around things like we have a shapes-based piano teaching method that uses no notation, no scales, can teach 48 chords in 25 minutes, and you're taking something that society is perceived that only clever kids do, playing the piano, often because of the way our music education system is set up. And, you know, you're taking that kid who's just come out of jail, hasn't, you know, been in school for 2 years, and say, right, I'm going to teach you to play the piano in half an hour so you can play a song that you want to play. And because you can do that using this shapes-based technique, which is really, really quick and easy, you unlock this thing that's perceived as complicated, you engender that sense of trust that's so important. Epistemic trust is a term that I'm very, very interested in, but I don't, again, have time to go into right now, because I've only got 20 minutes and 10 years of work to get through. I mean, so far, all I've described is a really fairly decent piece of youth work. Where it departs from that is that we've also invested about 200 grand probably now in the last few years in building basically our own social media platform. So within each session, the musician and the participant are able to capture, using their phones, all the micro successes within that session. So for instance, the kids just made an amazing drill track. They're really, really proud of it. And you not only capture their music and post it on their digital feed that looks like a Facebook feed or an Instagram feed, because it mirrors social media experiences, but it's a micro social network. It's just for that young person and whoever the significant adults are that are important in their life that they invite in. So you post the piece of music they've made, but you also capture the video reflection of how that participant feels about that process and what it feels like to be able to make this music that's culturally responsive to their interests. And that's really, really important, because essentially what then happens is at the end of every session, a notification goes out to whoever those significant adults are, parent, carer, social worker, mental health worker, head of year, whoever it might be. Notification goes out saying, Johnny, Jane, just completed a Noise Solution session. Come and check out what they've been doing. Basically, you're capturing competence. You're capturing this kid being good at something and projecting it onto the screens of all those significant adults so they can see Johnny or Jane being good at something as well. And because it presents as social media, they can interact with it. Now, from a theoretical perspective, what we believe is actually happening is you're externalizing that competency for that young person. You're taking it out of their head and allowing them, scaffolding their ability to process the fact that they are being good at something. You're challenging all those negative labels, because they're often coming from a background where basically they're being told that everything is going wrong. And there I am being good at something. And also these people who I've autonomously invited in, because their voices are important to me, are telling me that I am being good at something as well, because they're able to comment on the music and the creation process and the reflective videos of that young person as well. So that's essentially it. At its core, it's about engaging in a way that's most likely to engage the population of prolific offenders, non-attenders, school phobics, you know, tier 1 to tier 2 mental health referrals. It's a way of engaging them by avoiding all of those power issues that so often happen with professionals. It's a way of capturing or creating a space where they feel good at something, competent, capturing that competency, sharing it with others, and getting feedback on that as well. I'm going to play a very, very, very short video of a participant's experience of that, and a parent as well.
Noise Solution began with Simon, my tutor, coming to my house, and we just sort of sat down and he spoke to me about what it is I like about music and what I want to do. Then we began working with the MIDI keyboards and stuff just to sort of mess around and jam. Really had a nice time. Like that to me, that was just like hanging out with friends. Initially, I was kind of a bit skeptical, but I think that was mainly to do with things like self-confidence and being kind of self-conscious and stuff like that. Time went on, I really realized that it is a positive way of capturing that moment, and in a way that is unscripted, and it is just raw, and it is what's happening at that time. Sharing those videos was really important to me. And my mum, she was really almost surprised, but happy to be able to see where I am at, because I feel that those videos are a much better measure of my mental well-being than me coming home from work and not doing the dishwasher. It's just...
I've got some lovely video of the mum talking about it as well, but I'm aware of time. So essentially, we have this blog in the middle of everything that we do, and it's not just a passive receptacle of what happens in the sessions. It's an active agent of change through this process of creating this feedback loop around the participant for the voices of the people that they listen to. But the COVID situation meant that we were suddenly not able to do these face-to-face music sessions. So we had to work out ways to do this entirely digitally, and it's driven a whole bunch of innovation for us. So within the digital story now, there's a tab at the top where the participant, the young person, can go and check out where their sessions, when their sessions are going to be. We've integrated it with Zoom so that their Zoom link appears 5 minutes before every session, so you avoid all those security issues. And we've also adopted the use of the VIP Charanga platform as well, which is basically a Chrome-based online browser tool for creating music, so that we can zoom into the kids' front room or whatever it might be, and interactively create music using this browser-based tool. Which is just like a DAW, but you avoid all those issues around downloading software or having the right computer. Essentially, they just need Chrome. So that's been amazingly useful for us, and you can create, you know, really great music as well. And this platform also comes with a whole bunch of tutorials on different styles of music, showing you how to make, you know, beats or different elements of the track in lots of different styles using short YouTube style videos. So there's that self-directed learning element. That means the kid can, you know, between sessions engage with it. And yeah, you can create really fantastic music. What we've also done is also integrated an online video production platform as well, which you can reach from within our platform. So the kid can upload the MP3 that they've created in VIP, and it will algorithmically analyze it, looking for chops, where cuts should be made, and you can choose from loads of really, really great stock footage. You can see some stuff up here now at the moment. So you're creating not only really, really great sounding music really, really quickly, creating that sense of competency, but you're also presenting it as being really, really competent. It looks super slick when it's presented to those people, to the person themselves, and they're very, very proud of it, but also that audience of social workers, care coordinators, whoever, who haven't been able to engage this young person. Suddenly they're producing something really, really interesting. We did about, last year we did 2,000 hours of this one-to-one mentoring. But that was all face-to-face, creating 80 hours of those short video reflections, creating that elements of competence and relatedness through this digital platform. Once COVID kicked in, we moved to entirely digital delivery, which took about actually only 4 days to sort out. We were very lucky because we had this 10-year run-up of digital youth work. We've done about 800 hours in the last couple of months of purely online digital, using the stuff that I showed you in the previous slide. What I haven't talked about yet, though, is the fact that we can also, as well as collecting these beautiful stories, and for us as an organization, it's fantastic because everybody we work with creates their own case study told from their perspective with the co-production of their family and their key workers in the forms of these digital stories, which is beautiful. But we can also use the platform to collect quantitative data. And at the moment, we're experimenting and developing the use of interactive video to do that as well. So I recently recorded a video here, which is introducing people to the program. So it's the first thing they see when they come into the blog. And we're interested at the moment in doing some deeper level research. I'm interested in how we assess using a validated scale basic psychological needs as they are described in self-determination theory. So I've done a video going through the ethics of, you know, do you want to do this research? If you'd like to, that's fantastic. You don't have to, we can anonymize it. It's a human face to that message around ethics, which I think is really, really interesting. And then the video itself is interactive. So you can click buttons within it and it can logic branch. It can go to different videos from that video. And it can also direct you to quantitative surveys that we can build within the same platform. So here we've got WenWebs. So if they click this button, they'll get a survey, they click it. So we're collecting that quantitative data really easily. And that means that, I mean, we've been doing this for about 3 years now in terms of using the platform to collect this data. This use of interactive video is new within the last couple of months, but we've been using this process for a number of years now. And it means we can start to understand where we're having the most impact. So we're currently using the Warwick and Edinburgh scale for a whole bunch of reasons. The main reason we use the Warwick and Edinburgh scale is that it's validated, but it's also been used at scale. So we've got 60,000 responses from other organizations that we can compare what we're doing against. So there's a national average score. So we can see where the organization sits in terms of the impact it's having. But it tells us really, really briefly that we're much more impactful with 16 to 24-year-olds, and interestingly, twice as impactful with young women as we are with young men. So we get perceived as being an organization that works with young men in hoods who externalize behaviors, but actually those young women who are internalizing behaviors, trying to fade into the background on trajectories around self-harm, that's actually where we have the most impact. We've also done a whole bunch of statistical analysis, looking for statistical significance of impact on well-being as well. For those of you that don't know, I'm not going to presume that you do because you may not. Statistical significance is a term used often by commissioners looking to see what the probability of change is going to be. So what's the probability if I feed somebody into this process when they come out the other end that there will be a change? The confidence level to be able to say that you are statistically significant is very high. It's 95%. This figure here, P, stands for that probability we're trying to find. This 0.5 stands for that other 5% here. If you run some very posh maths on the Warwick and Edinburgh scale data that we collect, it will come back with a P figure. If that P figure is under P.05, below that, then you're within that 95% confidence level, and you can say that you are statistically significant. So yeah, so we ran, all this happens automatically within the platform. On this sample data, which was taken a few years ago, which was quite small, it was only 30 people, 35, we were massively statistically significant, P.00078, with a medium range of change of well-being. But 3 years later, we've got 170 pairs, or no, 155 pairs, sorry, and we've maintained that level of statistical significance. So it's not a fluke. We've also had external evaluations done as well. But we can, all this stuff's happening automatically, but we can present it as visual graphs really, really easily within the platform, so we can understand and see where we're having impact on a demographic basis or a geographic basis or a contract basis, which is really enlightening for us. We're seeing about 70% completion. These are taken from a year's worth of figures, 88% attendance, 40% re-engaging with education, 60% are finishing at the national average. I'm just coming up to 20 minutes. If you, oops, let me just finish, shut that up. We've also done a social return on investment figure, which shows for every £1 spent on noise solution, there's a £3.34 return, which is exciting for us in terms of savings for families and services. But essentially, we've got data coming out of our ears through the process without it having any impact on the organization. There's a whole bunch of other stuff I haven't had time to talk about. One of the ones I'm most excited about which I'll just briefly mention and then I'm done, is that we're doing a proof of concept piece of work with IBM at the moment, whereby they're going to plug in their AI software to extract the audio from those video reflections, and we'll be able to semantically analyze it for elements of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So we'll automatically know as a set of sessions progresses where that's not happening, and we can get the platform to automatically react to it. But that's a proof of concept piece of work that's going on at the moment. There you go. I need to turn this bloody phone off with its alarm going off. Hang on a second. There we go. Excellent. Done. Any questions?
Yes, there are questions.
Sorry, I whizzed through that. Sorry.
No, that's really great. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Simon. And yes, there are lots of questions coming through in the chat, which is really, really great. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to be slightly selective because I know, Simon, I don't think you're going to be with us at the end of the session, are you? So I'm going to try and pick those questions I think are going to, be really specific to you. One question from Cassie: does participants' well-being or sense of self endure beyond the duration of the activities? How do you know that, and why might that be?
The longitudinal question. It's one I get asked a lot. We're starting to build in longitudinal analysis from an anecdotal perspective. Yes. So, for instance, those 3 young people that I talked to, that I showed you the responses from at the beginning, those are all young people who, from a subjective perspective, identify noise pollution as the catalyst for change on a longitudinal trajectory that was changed. We haven't measured it so far because actually I feel the issues around attribution are so significant that I think it actually kind of misses the point. For me, I'm interested, what we can prove very, very clearly with our data is that we act as that catalyst for change for kids who are stuck in very, very negative patterns of behavior, where lots of other stuff isn't working. And unless you change that on the short term in a space where you can realistically measure it, and it's most likely to be you, unless you can do that, you're not going to see any longitudinal change at all. And there's so many attribution issues as it goes forward a month, 6 months, a year, 3 years. And that's not to say we're not going to do that, as that's part of the puzzle. But I'm really, I'm more invested in the shorter term, and I think that's, for us as a practical organization, is the focus. I'm not saying it's not important. Anecdotally, yes, we see it, but we haven't really measured it. But then I also have reservations about how useful that data is anyway.
Yeah, and sort of on a similar theme, I wondered, because you raised a lot, and this is also picking up on a question asked by Roxana. You talked a lot about sort of young people's sense of self and identity in terms of quite sort of obviously a psychological frame, in terms of a sort of emotional and almost therapeutic frame, using obviously the WEMWEBs, which is, people don't know, it's the Warwick and Edinburgh well-being and emotion well-being measurement scale, right? I forget what the WEBs bit is.
Yeah.
I should remember. But one question I had was, Roxana's question was about young people carrying on musical activity and engagement with music after. So after the 10 2-hour sessions, do the students follow on to make more music? And I suppose my question following on from that would be about young people's expression about themselves. Is it primarily in terms of self-confidence and so on, so I think is what we heard in the videos, or do you hear other things as well about themselves as artists, themselves as, as musician and so on?
Not so much. We very, very much focus on the process of creation as being a joyful thing. I as a professional musician, I had 25 years as a professional musician, 4 record contracts, traveled the world, did all the festivals, all of that stuff. And as a professional musician, I don't want to push vulnerable people through that process, which is who we work with predominantly. I don't think that's a very good idea, actually. What I'm more interested in is what we've lost through this commercialization is this understanding of the joy of music in communities, musicking. The idea of that's been lost, and it's much more about creating spaces where they can just enjoy themselves creating. Whatever it might be. We see 80% carry on making music, We do assess that. We see 40% progressing into other things. They may or may not be music related, sort of education or training or whatever it might be. But it's that shift in motivation and general sense of well-being that we're actually interested in because of those outcomes that we know come from it.
Yeah, lovely. And a final question, quick question from Peggy, who asked if you saw access to equipment as an economic barrier to young people who just don't have the financial resources. I mean, is that a problem you kind of encounter, seek to solve? How do you
the most significant problem we've had is digital access,
Right.
obviously, and digital poverty. So and some young people not wanting to take a purely digital route. Lots have, and lots have actually preferred it as well. It's been much better than I expected it to be. I was quite unsure as to whether it was going to work, but actually there's lots of examples of where it's been better for young people. But yeah, digital access is the main issue, and what we've been doing is posting laptops out to young people that we work with, essentially, and praying that they come back. Generally they do, which is good. But yeah, in terms of we very much work depending on what the interests of the young person are. So if they're interested in guitar, we'll work with guitar. If they want to make drill music, we'll make drill music, you know, whatever it might be. We've got quite a lot of nice sponsorship from Reverb, who are like an eBay of music instruments. They're a massive American company, and they give us money and we buy equipment for kids if that's the barrier as well.
That's great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And lots of others have asked questions. I think they're often questions that have more general relevance to the themes. I think we're going to come up again, so I'm going to hold us over to the end because we need to keep moving. But Simon, can I say thank you for your time and for the presentation.
If anybody has any questions, then just email me at simon@noisesolution.org. Quite happy, not a problem at all.
That's lovely. Thanks so much, Simon. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon. And can I then hand over to our next speaker, who is Frances Howard from Nottingham Trent. Frances, welcome.
Hello, I'm here. I've appeared. Thank you so much, Simon. That was brilliant. I really enjoy hearing about the project, and it's so kind of relevant and current, the switch to COVID and the ways of kind of working digitally that kind of youth work is going to have to kind of tune into, I think, over the next year or so. So yeah, that's really applicable. Thank you. And just to introduce my talk today, let me just click so I can click forward. Oh, okay. Oh, back. Here we go. My title, From the Bedroom to the Booth, again is drawing on this kind of synergy between music production and youth work, but in particular I'm going to talk about this social pattern of engagement that I experienced both in my field work through my PhD and also in my previous work as a youth worker on many of these music projects. So just to give a bit of an introduction and to kind of draw in the COVID context as well, because I don't think much research is going to not touch on COVID in the next few years. But these two images really kind of give the context about the diminishing youth spaces, diminishing opportunities for young people to go to youth clubs and to have that social connection, and also the kind of impinging mental health crisis potentially for young people because of coronavirus. But today I'm going to talk about the kind of space within youth clubs and youth centres for making music. Most youth centres have them, and these really range on a standard from these kind of professional standard recording studios to having a laptop in a corner or a little cupboard with microphones or speakers. So my paper is going to explore these spaces as ways of advancing young people's symbolic and social capital. So I'm drawing on Bourdieu here and their way of accessing these spaces. And it's interesting that Ian mentioned these questions of identity and expression, which I think will link across all of our papers. And these spaces of music production I thought were really important for developing these identities, but also giving access to professional level equipment and industry standard equipment, but also in terms of youth work terms, these kind of opportunities for collaboration with other young people and with youth workers as this kind of collegiate form of youth work and working together. So just to introduce my study, I've already said it's from my PhD not too long ago. So I undertook an ethnography where I went to 5 different youth projects and hung out and took part in their arts programmes. So my whole research focused on 5 different youth settings, but today I'm going to talk about 2 in particular. So you can see these in the bullet points. So youth media, these are all synonyms. This project was an open access programme run by a youth charity that ran 1 evening a week. So their music making activities range from lyric writing and performance, studio recording, music technology, even some instruments and band work, and the jam sessions, which were my favourite to take part in. The second project, which I called the Fresh Project, was run by a local education organisation, which was a voluntary programme, but it was based on referrals. So young people could refer themselves, or their parents might refer them if they were facing challenging circumstances. So this links with very much what Simon was saying about arriving under these kind of deficit modes, these deficit models. And again, this was an evening project. And it's interesting that both projects were funded by Youth Music. And the way that I undertook my research is that I drew on arts-based methods, or what I like to call a talk around art approach. So this often involved me, quite enjoyably, joining in on the programme with the participants. So young people were teaching me how to do DJing, how to do music production, and showing me the work that they'd made. And then as I kind of developed a relationship with them, this was about talking with them about what they'd made or sharing the lyrics they'd written, which I'm going to talk about shortly. But the 2 boxes on the right hand side of the screen, just to give you a bit of a clue on how I tried to work out what was going on here, how I tried to analyse this. So I draw on a combination of Paul Willis's work around common culture, and in particular his concept of bedroom culture that I'm going to talk about today, and Pierre Bourdieu's work around capitals, and looking in particular at how young people developed symbolic and social capitals through these programmes. So as I said, one of my forms of data was actually looking at young people's rap lyrics, and Brian, who's going to talk next, I know he's going to discuss this a lot more in detail. And the way that I engage with this data, or was exposed to this data, was often on young people's mobile phones. So this is me taking a photo from a mobile phone of somebody else's mobile phone, and these are what young people would share with me and how I would experience the data. And this is what I defined as a key part of bedroom culture, this process of music making that happens at home. Young people would say they were sat in their bedrooms writing lyrics, and then they'd come down to the project to use the studio, to record, to use instrumentals, to get a track out there. And so they work on this prior to coming to the projects, and then they come down to the youth centre to record it. So this image on the screen is a mobile phone that somebody had written at home and brought to the project. And many young people use mobile phones, computers, iPads to undertake these kind of music making practices. So these, what I call digital and DIY music making practices, really gave young people these authentic modes of production. They were really real and accessible in their lives. So youth cultures have historically had a large role in cultural production, and the arts have represented opportunities for young people to make sense of their world and the place in it. So creating music through these youth programmes I saw was a key area of transformation. The booth was like, not a TARDIS in some respect, but an area of transformation for these young people, for their identities, from a kind of a cultural consumer to a producer, as Ian alluded to earlier on, where this symbolic capital inclusively increased the possibilities for this stronger performance production. So it increased the ways that they were producing the work. So there, here I'm starting to touch on this pattern of engagement, what I've called this alone, together, alone pattern of engagement. And it's often overlooked when we think about bedroom culture. So for this production to be truly meaningful, young people had to come to a youth centre to make their music, or to share with others, or to perform, or to collaborate. And yes, they could have done this at home, but they often lacked the access to the professional standard equipment, and they also lacked access to peer interaction and feedback from the youth workers. And this was a really, really important and valuable element of these programmes, which was a kind of a synergy with youth work in this kind of engagement pattern. So I've talked about this quite a bit already, but what was really valuable about these programmes for the young people taking part on them was these access to professional spaces. This meant they could have industry standard equipment, which was a key affordance, and they could have really quick turnaround. So Simon before has talked about quick wins. You know, you can use this equipment, it's fairly accessible, it's simple to use, you can produce a track in no time at all. So in this way, the booth, this recording space, was a key resource, and what Willis would refer to as this kind of proto-community, a kind of different to the deficit identity built up for the young people. So on these programmes, each young people had studio time, which was scheduled into each session, and that was the key attraction for them. That's why they turned up, basically. And these proto-communities, these kind of groups of peers and youth workers together, came up with their own conceptions about what was judged as good. So the kind of instrumentals they used, the different lyrics they laid down, the kind of different presentation and singing and the effects of the music. So spatial resources like this afforded the development of this kind of social capital through these networks. So this excerpt here on a little box on the screen demonstrates how the young person viewed the studio space as this kind of a stepping stone, as like an advancement for them in their own terms of their own symbolic and social capital. So I'll just read the quote out for you, because I like to give young people's voice in this research as well. So it gives you studio time in it, trying to do all your music and sort out all your stuff, because before, when I was in the studio, I could mix it, but I couldn't bring it out. I didn't have a label or nothing. Now I can move on to a label, I can get it copied, and I can actually get it out there. Like I've been able to work with the right people to get it in shape, get it airplays and that, get it out there and to promote. So I think that the whole reason of this panel and what I really want to draw out for this presentation is about the synergies between music production or music making and youth work, and collaboration was a key practice there. So this often manifested in this shared frame of reference. Young people and youth workers liked similar music, or they shared the cultural influences of their music, often based around these similar understandings of popular culture. So much of this dialogue that I witnessed in the youth sessions was based around this kind of ritual of the track share. Quite a lot of them would start with, well, let's have a track share. You pick a track, we'll listen to it, then we'll discuss it, we'll think about what it means. And it's a way, this kind of practice of collaboration and this affordance of youth work within these settings. So when youth workers also had skills of musicians, there was really valuable improvisation and co-production with young people. So I've often talked about these improvised jam sessions that would just suddenly spring up in a corner with different instruments and vocalists and instrumentals. And many of these collaborations happened on a spontaneous basis. They were fantastic, based on who was at the session. So there was this sense of experimentation, vocalists singing each other's lyrics, layering up their sounds, playing with the arrangements. And this co-production between youth workers, musicians and young people was really this kind of two-way learning process. I think that really relates to what Simon was saying earlier on about redressing power imbalances. And it really afforded this spirit of collective endeavour through the contribution of both youth workers and young people's artistic skills and their aspirations for the production of their own work in their own right. So that's demonstrated here on the right-hand side by my field notes. So collaboration alongside these DIY and digital ways of making music were really culturally responsive to young people's tastes, influences, and also the resources that were available to them. So similar how Simon described, you start with young person, what music are they into? Right, let's go with that genre of music, but we're also going to try some different genres and introduce some other things that other people are interested in. So these programmes are really effective at accommodating previous musical instruments, experiences and identities, and encompassing these everyday practices and informal spheres of participation as a way of redefining these boundaries of music making. Quite often these young people hadn't done music education at school, and these were the only places they were taking part in music, as well as at home. And this very much accounts for how young people are engaging with music making today. So on to a slide that delves into a bit of my analysis. And so far I've been drawing on Willis in terms of bedroom culture, and now I turn to Bourdieu in terms of looking at the capitals and how they advantage or potentially disadvantage young people. So this paper, I'm arguing that involvement in these programmes enabled young people to develop symbolic and social capitals, in particular linked to music. So this trying on of identities, trying to become an artist, which represents symbolic capital accrual, and that has a kind of previous research has shown has had lasting impact on individuals. So music, we know, is often shown as a badge of identity, and this can be a deficit identity, but in young people's development of this, it can be really valuable for kind of personal and social development. And many of these individual identities were overlapping and different and are linked to music genre, class and race and media imagery. So social capitals included one of the ways of working like an artist or ways of performing, things that they learned from youth workers and musicians, as well as artist languages, professional production equipment and environments. So these spaces, the booth, as I like to call it, as it was called, where young people created work contributed to this symbolic capital. These recording spaces from the projects bestowed a particular sense of identity on young people. And there was even a hierarchy within this. It was very, very interesting. So demonstrating success in being able to use and work with these spaces ratified your viability as an artist, or ratified you within the group, and in particular in front of your peers, in front of others. So this excerpt from my field notes shows the kind of importance of this space for this dispositions of becoming professional, for being taken seriously as an artist, for being situated within this group. And what I noticed, what was really interesting, again here is synergy with kind of youth work and the mentoring element, is that new people joining the group who are often slow to use the space because of a lack of confidence were mentored by more established members of the youth groups. So this was their kind of accrual in sort of social capital in a different way. So what I found was that these music programmes afforded young people the opportunity to use markers of identity, and this was strongly linked to the kind of album artwork they chose to make. So similar to Simon's projects, where everybody's wanting to make music videos to kind of put out there with their tracks, a part of the programmes I took part in where young people were creating these kind of visual album covers. And what I've developed here, the image on the right, is a bit of a test for you to see how much hip-hop artists you know from the 90s and 2000s. But actually, in this little montage of 6 images, 2 of them have been created by young people on a youth project. So for people who aren't familiar with this kind of iconography of these hip-hop albums, you are unsure which one is created by a young person and which one is created by an artist. And this is how I'm trying to show this kind of this bestowing of kind of symbolic capital through the work that young people are trying to make. So they've been intentionally put together to convey these young people's attempts to align themselves through these kind of subcultural dispositions, subcultural ways of being. So these album artworks here are strong assertions of this symbolic capital, which deliberately draw on traditions of gangster style imagery and great thought. I saw young people putting great attention to detail into creating these images. So this included things like the parental advisory logo, yeah, that's seen as a kind of a symbol, a good brand, a good symbol. Often these dark and recognizable figures, gang logos, particular hand gestures, use of certain colors, lots of black, lots of red, lots of white, lots of monochrome going on, and artifacts such as like hoodies and chains. And they were all significant elements of which the young people were highly aware and wanted to replicate for themselves. So I'm just moving on to my last slide now and just thinking about the implications of what I've talked about today in this kind of wider panel for the future. So what I hope I've done in this paper is to demonstrate the importance of these youth spaces and music projects for young people's symbolic and social capital, and the importance of them to be able to access these spaces. So bestowing particular senses of identity, these spaces of music production are important areas for the development of young people becoming professional, to feel they're becoming professional, to feel they're being taken seriously as an artist, or that they have the potential to develop in that way. So they also represent opportunities within the kind of youth work field for creative and collaborative work, for co-production, for negotiation, for informal education. And this has wider implications than kind of simply calls to stop closing down youth clubs and keep funding music projects, people might think that young people are simply replicating deviance or just hanging out, but actually these youth spaces offer an important opportunity for identity development and reflection upon that identity. An opportunity through this kind of social pattern of engagement to come out of their bedrooms and to become more socially engaged, to feel connected and to feel part of something. Now, this does shift slightly in the current COVID context, and I know that youth workers are striving very hard to maintain these connections with young people. You've heard about all the work Simon's doing with his organisation to kind of build on this online platform and to maintain that, and how that's going well. And that's why projects like this are key in keeping this offer viable for young people. How do we maintain this pattern of engagement, alone, together, alone, and to ensure that bedroom culture is not just all young people have? We can see the wider value of being part of these projects. So I'm currently part of a new piece of research where I'm interviewing young musicians about their experiences during lockdown, as many of them have cited projects like these that happened in youth clubs or after school projects as sparking their musical interest. This is where they learned their craft, this is where they started their passion that now continues their kind of musical journey into life. So an important arena for youth work and youth development, and starting an engagement with or a journey with music that can last a lifetime. Thank you. Oh, and I forgot, I've got a poll.
Yes.
So, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. As a way to kind of keep these sessions a bit more interactive, so you're not just looking at a screen and listening to somebody talking all the time, we are really interested in your thoughts and your experiences, particularly on this topic of youth work and music production. So the poll that I'd like you to take part in, which should be popping up on your screen right now, and it's a word cloud, so it'll filter together the kind of the common words and all the different responses, are your experiences of the synergies, but also the conflicts of music production as a form of youth work. So I'll give a couple of minutes now just to respond to that poll, and we'll see what kind of word cloud will appear on our screen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And there are, as people do that, lots of questions. I just stopped my video, there we go. I need to, yeah, there are lots of questions coming through I think are really, really useful. I think one of the things that's striking is the shift from a kind of quite psychological or psychologized or therapeutic kind of framing in Noise Solution to your work, where you're looking at it from a much more kind of community, like language of communities, social capital. It's a much more sociological kind of framing, obviously, and just kind of what that does in the analysis. And there are a few questions that came up, I think, around that. One question was about, I used the language of proto-communities, and I suppose one question about that was about the inclusiveness or not of those communities as it related to particular genres of music and forms of representation. So one question was about, the kind of, were there issues around the glorification of certain kinds of kind of violence or sexism or racism or gang culture in lyrics and representations that, how did the communities kind of manage those issues of challenge, of inclusion, and so on?
I think the youth workers were highly skilled in dealing with all of this. And actually, I think one of the values of the project was that actually, and I've got a really great quote from a youth worker, sometimes I use it in presentations, is that all young people arrive wanting to do grime and drill. Okay, and over time, because of working with youth workers and different young people and older, more peer mentors, they open their eyes a bit more to all these different kinds of music. They come in and they go default to this kind of like commercialized kind of rap. And I know Brian's going to talk about this a bit later on in his presentation, these kind of commercialized values of kind of like money and sexism and violence and guns, etc., to actually realizing about, no, actually I can talk about my life and what's important to me. And I think that comes from really skilled facilitation from the youth workers. I mean, if you took music out of this equation and it was just a generic youth session, the youth workers would be having those conversations anyway, but they wouldn't do it in such a didactic way where they'd say, you can't say that or you can't do that. It's kind of like a learning process, a kind of an informal learning process in a way. And actually, I never heard youth workers say, you can't say that or don't do that. But there was definitely a journey young people went on from when they arrived and were particularly into a certain genre to when they had been there like a month, a year, 2 years or whatever. And they were much more open, particularly through the process of collaborating and that idea of track share, you know, this two-way knowledge. Music is influences are out there all around us, and that they would kind of come to that realization towards the end of the projects.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really interesting about the roles, the sort of the roles in relation to our understandings of subcultural kind of formations and all of that. And then another question that comes up, I suppose related from Liz, is, you know, did workers need to be aware of the possibility for cultural appropriation in particular kind of genres of music that people were engaging in being deployed?
And I think because all the youth workers were from the local area, so actually the class and race of the youth workers mirrored the class and race of the participants. And I think that's why, I mean, I'm not saying that works for everything. And I think that's why they had this shared frame of cultural reference, because they were all interested in music in some form. And it's kind of like a power level in a way, that they weren't saying, you've got to do this style of music. They were just sharing their different interests in music. So no, I don't think, from my perspective, I don't think it was a form of cultural appropriation, because it was, this definitely shared frame of reference. They're based around popular music, and they'd come in and go, have you heard the latest track from so-and-so? And have you heard this? And did you know who was here last week recording the studio? They've just put a track out on SoundCloud. So it's very much, I would like to see it as like an involvement within a scene. There was very much, if we're talking subculturally, a music scene that was created around these projects. And through the different networks that the youth workers and musicians had, some young people actually went on to do DJ gigs, rap battle performances, through the connection, the social networks, and through these local music scenes that popped up.
Yeah, and I find it's a really interesting. I mean, again, I keep coming at the kind of contrast in languages that the two presentations had, which I think actually makes for a really rich discussion. But I think the language you've got, as you're drawing on scenes, subcultures, and so on, and the complexity of youth workers' roles and engaging across these different registers of kind of the psychological impacts for young people, or kind of emotional impacts for young people, versus and also. Scenes, communities, subculture. I mean, it's a massively kind of complex process. One of the questions was about from Cassie was about whether the activities offered young people routes into professional careers in the arts, whether they translated into real opportunities. And again, I kind of felt similarly, like the narrative part of it here is from bedroom to booth, from kind of some sort of private to public, and I wondered whether that was a public story of kind of community participation or public participation, or about capital exchange in terms of social mobility and the private sector and cultural industries, and yeah, I wondered whether, so did it translate into careers for people, or for young people, or
only so much, in that music is highly precarious work anyway. So again, things like being a DJ on a lineup for the night, or even running your own music workshops. Some of the young people were offered to do the Arts Award qualification, so there was that kind of educational route as well. And one of the projects has a link with a local kind of music tech college, so they would take young people for interviews. But that kind of that description of mine really instrumentalizes what was really at the heart of the projects. It wasn't, they could be listed as outcomes for funders or whatever, but that wasn't really what the projects were about. They were about the young people, again, using music as a tool for self-development and realization of, like Simon said, being good at something and feeling they could accomplish something, and just the high level that they could do things through technologies, and the youth workers' skills and their musical skills was, I think, the key affordance of those projects for the young people.
That's really
yeah, in terms of measurement, there's a kind of a real tension there.
There is, yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what I find kind of fascinating across the two as well. And I wonder slightly if you know, if the kind of sort of well-being and psychological kind of register gives itself to certain kinds of data, you know, that are maybe better at demonstrating or demonstrate impact in a particular way. And you know, the kind of this kind of methodology, which is talking quite richly about culture and community, yeah, how we talk about change and make it understandable and tangible outside of the space that it's occurring in, is I mean, it's a long-standing issue, isn't it? I'm aware of time. Thank you so much. I know there are questions I haven't got to. Again, we'll hopefully bring them in at the end. But just at this point, can I say thank you, Francis, for that? I think it was a really fascinating presentation. And can I introduce Brian McShane, who's going to speak to us now. Brian from Coventry University. Hi, Brian.
Hello, Ian. Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So, thanks as well to Francis and Simon for your presentations. And hopefully people are going to see quite a lot of crossovers between what I'm going to talk about now, and also quite a few differences, I suppose, in the way that the work that we're doing around music is being conducted with young people. So a little bit about the title. This paper comes from my PhD research that was conducted a few years ago when I was a youth worker in London, working in one of the EGYV teams, and that stands for Ending Gang and Youth Violence. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And these teams were brought in after the UK riots in 2011 and ran for about 5 or 6 years, working in 52 local areas across the UK with young people that were deemed at risk or at serious risk of committing or being victims of serious youth violence and gang violence. So the title comes from something that one of the young people that I work with said to me in a studio session as we had some conflict around what his lyrics were about. And this really forms the focus of the paper, with the subtitle being "The Studio as an Emancipatory Space and the Embedded Conflict of Intervention." And this is very much how these studio sessions that I'm going to talk about operated, where I, as a youth worker, tried to work with young people and tried to create this space for them. And both I and them constantly had this higher power, as it were, this EGYV program bearing down on us, telling us what we could and couldn't do. So, see if I can move this. Yep, okay. So the focus of today's paper is the music studio as it was used by young men to explore particular issues and identities. And as I've said, it draws on my ethnographic research that was conducted through what I call a relational youth work practice. So just to say very quickly a little bit about that. My research focuses very much on young men and masculinities. And that was very much aided by the fact that the youth work project I worked on, and EGYV as a program, was actually solely attended by young men, which may not come as a particular surprise to those of you familiar with the gang literature and research done on that. But the idea of this relational practice and working with young men is that it draws on feminist perspectives and an understanding of gender relations of power to try to listen to young men, but also to try to challenge some of the issues that they're facing around masculinities and violence, and maybe some of the behaviours that they are engaged in. So it's a process of trying to give them a space to bring out an emotional side, let's say, or a side to them that they often are not having a space to put forward. So what I want to explore is the way that young men use the music studio in ways that can be considered expressive, an emotional space, and maybe also entrepreneurial, to move away from narratives of the gang. And as I've said, to understand the tensions that both they and I encountered in terms of this process. So to say a little bit about the EGYV program for people that aren't familiar with it, and this being the kind of backdrop that framed these music studio sessions and made the provision available. As many of you that are engaged in youth work or have been youth workers or do research on young people will know, the last 10 years have seen a removal of what we knew as statutory youth work and a move to a focus on prevention. And you can see from the quote on the slide by Bernard Davies, and something that Simon touched on from his previous experience working with local authorities, this has really been defined by young people as a deficit model. And more youth workers to demonstrate these ideas of predefined impacts that can be measured statistically, which Simon seems to have very adeptly kind of cornered and be doing very well, but this certainly wasn't the case on EGYV. So Smithson and Ralph say that government-funded gang interventions are currently bereft of a what works approach, and EGYV is very much an example of this. So it focused very much on risky youth and was brought in, as I said, after the 2011 riots, where the government explanation for those events were that gangs were responsible. And EGYV came in soon after the riots and was part of the police Operation Trident, which was previously used to focus on black gun crime. So it was then quite subtly reframed to focus on gangs. So you can see the trajectory there of what EGYV's focus is, a move from black on black gun crime to gangs. And what this shows is the regular association of EGYV with knife crime and youth violence, and also the associations that it drew with grime and rap and drill music and the criminalisation of these subcultures. And EGYV specifically, working with the police unit Trident, drew on what you may be aware of is called the gangs matrix. So this has recently been discredited, but was a list of names of young people warranting continual monitoring and surveillance that operated very secretively and has only recently, I think, come into the public domain and been brought out that young people were solely being profiled by ethnicity. So based on this EGYV programme that took its names from Trident, that used the gangs matrix, young people were informed by the police that they could either work with me in this particular area and similarly in other areas, or that they would be subject to repeated police attention in something that the local borough police commander confirmed to me was the Al Capone approach. So young people were referred to us on this EGYV team and detailed monitoring forms were filled out after any contact. Individual meetings and group sessions were evaluated towards the effectiveness of my work as an intervention. And in relation to the wider panel, this obviously raises two initial questions in relation to measurement. The racialised targeting of those on the gangs matrix for police attention or youth work interventions, and the attempt to measure whether we were actually ending gang and youth violence. So what's been clear to practitioners from the start and along the way, observers, including researchers, is this problematic disconnect at the heart of the policy, that youth violence isn't directly related to gangs in the way police define them. So we were being given names of young people and working with them who weren't maybe directly in gangs, they had some affiliation, the definition of a gang wasn't clear in terms of how the police were using it and how it was being defined by practitioners. There was a lot of lack of clarity around this. And this backdrop, this EGYV programme, forms the background and opens up the space in which I met young men. And I want to move forward now and draw directly on my ethnographic research and the studio sessions that I ran with these young men to look at the tensions that came up when these young men were trying to record and produce and make their own music within these studio sessions. So the relationships that I had and the peer groups I worked with were obviously immediately defined by the EGYV programme. As gang member and worker, so them and I, or as young person and outsider. And as I spent more sessions in the studios with them, it became clear that our roles had been positioned there in a very particular way, and actually that there wasn't much negotiation required around who we were. So they often half-jokingly reminded me whenever we'd meet, prefaced with a broad smile, "Oh, this guy, you're feds, right?" And I'm sure you're all probably familiar, but feds means police. So there was an expectation on myself as a worker and on these young people that was very apparent to both of us from the start, that we were required to build relationships that could successfully show a measurable change, as Simon's work was neatly doing, but here specifically on the EGYV programme in relation to gang activities. Now, again, these were themselves hard to measure or uncertain terms, but pertinent to these studio sessions was the specific rule that lyrics and recorded content could not contain any gang references or references to violence, and needed to have, and I quote from the programme outline, a positive outlook. So within this EGYV programme, the first young person that I met was called Joel, or we'll call him Joel. And we met at his house with his mum, and he was very polite and agreeable. And I met him again a week later and played football with him and a couple of friends. And they asked me, the friends, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "I'm a youth worker." And they asked me, "Are you police?" I said, "No." "Are you police?" I said, "No." This continued a few times. And they answered me, I asked them, "Why do you think I'm police?" They said, "Well, you move like police." So there's something interesting there about how young men carry their bodies and how they read other bodies. And this was something that I picked up on more and more in the studio sessions that I'm going to touch on now. But once Joel's friends left me, he approached me directly and he said to me, "Look, I know how this works. What are you here for? What can you do for me?" And I discussed the project remit in my own words and explained to him, "Look, there's funding here. Obviously, your name's been put down, you know, you're the object of police focus, but there's funding for activities that show a positive diversion from the gang activities that you are supposedly involved in and that they're interested in." And his response was clear to me. He said, "Look, you seem like a good guy, but you'll be here for a few months, maybe a year, then you'll be gone. You're just another worker." He said, "Look, I'm willing to do football sessions to tick a box to show that I'm doing the right thing, but what I'd really like to do would be studio sessions." And at that point, these weren't on the agenda, but I went away and spoke to my manager. And after a few months, we managed to set these up. So this brings us to the recording studio as a space of engagement. So amidst these tensions, these initial tensions in our relationship, and I guess importantly in terms of building trust, once these sessions were underway, young people's interest, and particularly, and this was something that was touched on in the questions that were asked of the previous speakers, the quality of the equipment available. So this was a very professional recording studio. It had a full computer setup with soundboard, and I'm not a sound engineer or musician, but it had the full kind of works. And there was another youth worker that attended who was a practicing sound engineer. So he ran that whole side of things. And said very little else, to be honest. So that was just his role. But this provision guaranteed young people's attendance, young people that were framed as risky, hard to reach, that the police were struggling to make contact with, unsurprisingly, but that other youth workers were struggling to make contact with as well. And we had a regular weekly attendance from people like Joel that were on the gangs matrix, and also a widening number of their peers. And I had to limit the numbers and say at a certain point, you know, this is how many people can come, which was very difficult because young people said to me, "Well, he's on the list, that means he can come, I'm not, why can't I come?" But they more or less worked it out amongst themselves, and more or less the correct number would come each week. So the immediate goal, I think, for many of these young men was a kind of local notoriety. And some of this was related to the activities they were involved in, which did involve some peer group formations that under certain definitions can be seen as a gang. And it's probably true to say that most of them were involved in or victims of some form of peer-to-peer violence. So these were definite issues in their lives. And in that sense, they did want to use the studio towards developing some kind of status in relation to other groups. But it was also very much as part of wanting a wider recognition in the space of what's become and what's really developed in the last decade of a burgeoning DIY urban music culture within London and other urban centres, Manchester, Birmingham, and more widely in the UK. And that DIY culture has been very well documented by research by Joy White on the entrepreneurialism of grime, and also Caspar Melville on the history of black music in London. And those are both references in my final slide, if you want to look those up. So these young men came and they spoke about the possibilities of making money from their music. So I'm not going to comment on my views on their music per se, but it was, you know, they had practiced it a lot. It was reasonable quality. They were looking at it as a possibility of making money. And as a preface to that, they had a kind of figure in mind of trying to get 100,000 views on YouTube, which they thought might signal to a wider public and to themselves that there was something here that they could pursue. So there is research, Stahl and Pete Dale, Dickens and Loney, which again are in the references, that looks at young people's engagement in music performance and production and sees it as an important space of alternative educational practice and self-expression, particularly as Simon and Francis have highlighted, for those lacking in confidence, self-esteem or cultural validation. However, these initial studio experiences, interactions between myself and the young men in terms of inhabiting the space, in terms of them being in the space, were very guarded, and they were very unsure of showing themselves in ways where they, I guess, would normally reveal much less. So arriving for the third studio session, I was met with the sound engineer, the other youth worker, and 3 young men that I didn't know. And I walked in and sat down for a couple of minutes just in silence. No one spoke and they didn't make eye contact with me. So eventually I asked them, who told you about this session? In an attempt to find a shared contact. A friend, one simply said, and looked down at his feet. I looked across at the other 3 young men, and 2 looked back at me and looked away quickly, and the other just refused to make eye contact. So we sat and we waited. And in what follows, I want to introduce 2 main people, which are Sean and Joel. So Joel was a young man that I've already introduced, that I worked with closely, and I was his key worker, and he was on the Games Matrix. And Sean was a very close friend of his who was involved in the same peer group and similar activities, but who wasn't known to youth workers or police. So Sean turned up to the studio in a very confident way, his body bouncing, large chain swinging on his neck, said hello to everyone, saw me, and then explained, oh, these are my friends, I've invited them because Joel can't be with us this week. So we sat down, and the group convened together and spoke amongst each other, and as quietly as they could in shorthand and slang, to try and make sure that me and the other youth worker couldn't hear. And it's really indicative of how young men in a lot of the projects that I worked in behaved. They were very aware of being surveilled. They were very aware of both police and youth work presence, and they really practiced an active distrust. That was kind of the currency that they came with. So the recording studio as a space of engagement really was important, to try and start working with them, as I noted at the beginning, around these kind of issues of masculinity, around issues of trust, around me having a space to be able to start to challenge them or build trust with them to discuss the issues that they were facing in their lives. So Sean took the lead, and as you can see from the quote on the side, he began to read the bars off his phone, looking at me every few words. He very uncertainly was reading his phone and almost speaking through rather than really delivering his bars. And he was quiet and hesitant, unsure, and he didn't finish. And he turned to look at me, and I offered him raised eyebrows in return, and he looked away and said, "I'll go again." So he tries a second time, and he's unhappy again with his second attempt, and his friends that I haven't met before criticize him and say, "What are you doing? You're not able to do it." And Sean shrugs this off and sits down as nothing. And one of the other boys gets up next, who we'll call Jordan. And Jordan recites some of the lyrics he's written. And I should probably, well, it would probably be unfair for me to try and say this with the gusto and the delivery that they did, so I have to read them. But Jordan's lyrics go, "Don't talk about the life that you don't live, and don't talk about the food that you don't give." So food is a reference to drugs and drug dealing. So Jordan said this really slowly, and he was really trying to fill out the sound of his voice and put real meaning and a real kind of embodied, a particular masculinity into it. And it looked to me like he was really struggling. He kept saying it quietly to himself and then trying to say it in a stronger way. And Sean, in a retort to him, his previous critique, said, "I think you've got ADHD, man, can't stay quiet." Sean says to Jordan, I'm calm, and steadies himself and goes again. So many of the young men would attempt this performance as they started to try and, I guess, give an authenticity and a kind of meaning to the bars they were saying. And that brought up a really interesting tension that I discussed with them more as the studio sessions progressed, and I was able to start engaging with them around some of the things they were saying. And there was an uncertainty for them very much presenting their lyrics in my presence, which I think can be read as an acknowledgement of others' presence and the understanding of the studio as a shared or public space. In this case, it's not a bedroom or a discrete booth with full artistic license. They know that there are some rules there. And there's a questioning already of who is saying this? What does it mean? Should I be saying this? Is this me? In the following session, they're all practicing their bars. Joel and Sean are now at this session together, and Joel begins rapping by detailing how a rival will get attacked. The other boys that are there all, ooh, they say, and I bring up the lyrics thing and say, look, remember what the deal is. This can't be a gang thing, this session, it's got to be kind of positive lyrics. And Joel's response to me was, I don't care, that's going in, it's what I've got, this is where I'm coming from. And he starts getting abusive to me, stands up, starts being a bit threatening. And Sean actually went to check him and said, you're moving weird, you know, why are you doing this? And gave me a look, looking visibly surprised at Joel's behaviour based on our current shared enterprise. And I think the respect that we, in just 3 sessions, had started to build around having that shared studio space. So in this way, these early sessions were a testing of how we share the space, what was going to be acceptable. And this, to me, signalled the young people's commitment to the studio and their respect for the rules of the space. But it also showed that, as many of you who are academics or youth workers who speak publicly will know, that presenting your voice in public and claiming a public voice, sharing your ideas, is a challenging experience. So these music studio sessions very much allowed young men to express how they felt as one-to-one sessions or to intimate audiences, and they developed a confidence in their own performance and then questioned that as something, as whether they were willing to own it or not. And I think this is very important in the context where boasts and bravado really fueled a lot of the peer conflicts they were caught up in, and something they challenged each other on as a way of maintaining their own self-respect and authenticity. So it was quite clear in these moments that there was a potential for dialogue in direct relation actually to the broad ideas of the EGYV programme in terms of tackling issues, perhaps not ending, but in terms of tackling issues around violence and gangs, and more importantly for me, the specific ways that these entered and affected the young men's lives. So within this space, where I was trying to get to, and what was never really the focus of the EGYV programme in terms of how it was presented, although maybe deeply implicit to its ideas, this was there, was music production as an alternative social education. So as both Simon and Francis's papers showed, with digital technologies, the studio is not a static space, but one that can be mobile and is also utilised as part of a range of resources that young people make use of. So these young people, Joel and Sean and their peers, would return each week with newly developed lyrics, a new beat that they had got from a friend who made beats or that they bought online, an additional verse to be added to last week's track. And every week they were able to take away a download of what we'd made so they could play it on their phones, air it to immediate friends and acquaintances. And in this way, the music studio sessions really operated as spaces where young men had a way to express themselves and touching on what Francis was talking about, were able to create value and capital in their wider social worlds. And I think it's really worth labouring the point that a huge amount of work went in, and creativity went into writing these lyrics, the presentation of self, the recording of these tracks, the learning of the other youth worker, Ethan, around what he was doing with the music production and the sound production, the producing the video in their spare time, and then obviously posting that to YouTube, which required really, I would say, a lot more work than the GCE college project, that they were also doing. And there was no financial or mentoring support beyond the relational approach that I was using them, that they had to do this. So they had video artists, cameramen, dancers in these videos, a whole range of things, obviously to some extent inspired by wider dreams they had of fame and celebrity, and maybe the seeming proximity of these pathways through new technologies. But they also drew on these tracks and produced caps, hoodies, and monetized their kind of local capital and their lifestyles as a way to make use of these youth club facilities and making themselves some money in local cultural economies of consumption. So it very much shows that young men were very connected to their economic future. Ironically, as championed by the EGYV programme, the focus of this was very much to get them into formal education or training. And the cultural productions they were making were very much not seen as fitting into that. So, as I've said, what was very distinct in this youth work context was the level of studio equipment available, and this experienced sound engineer. So the learning process that took place and the engagement in producing music, as I've said, was not a process that was ever evaluated in the forms that I was asked to fill in, or the monitoring that was done, or the questions I was asked by my line manager in terms of what he was asked to produce to his higher line manager. So it was never really properly, in my opinion, evaluated the effort and the work that these young people were putting into the sessions. And obviously, drawing back to Caspar Melville's work that, as I've said, is listed in the references at the end, this is part of a long lineage of Black music historically not being seen as a legitimate cultural production, which is probably changing in terms of mainstream music now to a certain extent, but certainly was something that affected these young men. And music, I think, here was seen as a distraction activity by the programme, and the focus really was moving young people into music and then on into something else. So, being taken seriously, looking at this idea of the tension between young men engaging in a much more emotional way, or finding a space to be able to explore their own emotions, and the way this was in tension with the EGYV programme as an intervention. I think that what I want to consider here is that the space of the music studio really allowed an expressive outlet, which does ally to ideas of youth work practice as an alternative social education. But simultaneously, how the particular focus on measuring behaviour then curtailed the space that we started to open together. And in their music sessions, in developing written lyrics and recording them, young men took this very seriously. They were very focused on putting a real or authentic version of themselves out there. So many of Joel and Sean's lyrics were about everyday life, were about selling drugs, were about misogynistic perspectives of women, were about bravado, were about aggrandizing themselves, the use of weapons, the use of interpersonal violence. And they drew on these stereotypical representations of masculinity at the start, and I would say throughout all of the sessions. But what was very noticeable, and what is maybe slightly disappointing for me, is that I have no records of this because of their involvement with the police. They were very guarded around their own productions. And as both a youth worker and a researcher, simultaneously, the ethics covering my practice in both of those spheres meant that I had to protect their identities in terms of the possible repercussions for them from other groups in other areas. So it's not possible to show really the process through photographs or through their music, but there was a very, very, maybe not quick, but a very definite shift in the presentation of themselves as young men and the lyrics they were happy to present as a public voice that started to shift across the sessions when they started to share references and narratives of family being imprisoned, the lack of opportunities available for them as young working class Black men, Black history, both in the UK and more internationally, the threat of violence that they not only faced in everyday urban life, but also symbolically and in terms of being men, and the common aspirational dreams of making money and then taking that to a more locally focused position of trying to support their families and their mums. And I think as these discussions and presentations developed, what was very conspicuous by its absence was male role models or fathers and their discussion of fathers in their music. I can count the number of times that young men brought up their fathers in the years I worked with them on one hand and almost less. And the most notable example of a discussion around fathers was outside of the studio with Joel in a gym setting when he turned around and asked me, what happened, where's your dad? What's your relationship with your dad? Which no young man had ever asked me. And we had a discussion and I shared the history of me and my father and he shared the history of him and his. And that to me was really very much a product of the discussions and the practice of the music production in the studio and the trust that we built in that space. So in this way, music can be a form of catharsis and the feelings that young men have are acted out as a testing ground. And the relations between these internal feelings begin to be understood and shared more. However, in the EGYV programme, the focus on interventions, there was this proviso that lyrics were not gang related. And obviously this meant that it created this regular tension. So having run for several months with a few short breaks, Joel attended a final studio session with an older friend who was on the target list and others who weren't, again, blurring the cut and dry nature of the targeting. And this time all four had pre-written lyrics on their phones. A hook, which is a chorus to the track, had been designed, and they had a beat that they downloaded and they synced up to the studio computer. So they had done a huge amount of preparation to lay down this track. It was all ordered and they had worked it all out. And they were very excited. And before they started recording, they started reciting the hook. And they stopped and looked at each other and said, "This is dead. This hook is rubbish." So they quickly reconvened and brainstormed ideas around what their lyrics were about to write a new hook, gave a melody to it, worked it out, and then they were ready to go. And their lyrics focused on social deprivation, black market economies, the choice or focus to not be or be in education, becoming involved in crime, with the main hook they'd agreed on being, "They don't want to see me living right." And again, I should probably, to give it credit, sing it in the way it was sung, but I'm not going to do that for you today. So they recorded each section and the sound engineer put it together, working with them to add effects and stabs, which is the echo after each ending line. And by the next week, they downloaded it, taken it away, had it mastered at another studio at their own cost, uploaded it to YouTube with a video accompanying it. So new lyrics were brought to record a new track. I'm going to be one more minute. So prior to this session, after them recording putting their track onto YouTube, prior to the next session, my team leader called me in and spoke to me and said that no more content could be recorded. The visibility on YouTube of their videos was actually where Trident was getting a lot of its intelligence on who was involved in local gangs, and through this was compiling the gangs matrix, which you can obviously see as quite perverse. So for me, the music was definitely trap or road music, but it wasn't directly gang related, and the young men had been very committed to using the studio and treated the whole enterprise with respect. And after repeating the rules around using the studio, Joel was dismayed. He said to me, "This is my life. Like, this is how I'm living. I've worked on this. This is how I'm living. You want me to be here. You wanted me to come here to do right. I'm doing it. And I can't even talk about what's happening outside and what's happening in my life." So to finish, to leave you, while I can discuss these issues here in an academic paper, and while I can lay my own subjectivity bare, and with the young men's approval discuss theirs, in a youth workspace that's opened up and funded for them, they can't even discuss what's going on in their own lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was really fascinating and rich, and a huge amount there to think about. and lots of questions and lots of engagement. I'm really, really conscious of time, and I feel my duty as chair to now kind of be quite limiting of discussion just because of time, and I'm really sorry about that, because the engagement has been so good. Let me ask one or at most two questions, and Brian, just in response. The question that was most kind of people expressed most interest in on the chat was this: was EGYV was a top-down reactive measure. Young people seem to understand this. To what extent was the work performative, and how much agency do workers and young people have using arts-based methods, I guess, in that context?
So just to clarify, to what extent was the work performative, my work?
I think that's the intention of the question. Yeah, I've read it as is, but my understanding is, yeah, I think your work.
I gave some indication, I think, or my answer to that would be the indication I gave at the beginning around what I conceptualized or how I saw my work as a relational methodology. So it was performative, unfortunately, in the sense that the end result is maybe not what I hoped. You know, we were limited by a restructuring of EGYV. Joel's assertion that I would be gone after a certain amount of time, I was there for longer than he said, but he was ultimately correct and obviously knew how things worked well. So it was performative in that sense. My youth work practice wasn't able to transcend that. I think that there's a very small takeaway for me, which is, did I affect change in their life? I can't necessarily say that I did. Did I build a positive relationship in terms of the ideas of masculinities with them? Yes, I did. And I think that in that particular context, that was, you know, maybe as much as I could do. So yeah, it was a difficult scenario. The paper, I guess, operates as a critique of that EGYV process.
Yeah. It's a genuinely really fascinating answer, and again, I'm really conscious of time, because let me flip to another kind of question, which is about the idea of the space and the relationships and the trust that's there. And again, sticking with some of this idea of some of the kind of structural elements, if you like, that sit around youth work and some of the processes that are happening in a space like that. We have questions that ask, in the context of young men's, quotes, active distrust, how might statistical and video diary methods of evaluation been received in that space? So I suppose, broadly speaking, there's a specific question and about video and diary methods, statistical methods, but I suppose even more broadly, a question about the kinds of your own methodology. Like, you've written this up in a very ethnographic, really rich way that has real power, I think, in the account. We also see lots of other accounts of kind of data collection and so on, which are very different methodologically. And how do you think those kinds of alternative methods or other methods of collecting information about evaluation or impact, could they be done in a space like that? How might they be received in those relationships?
You know, having spoken with Simon and having prior to this, obviously, and having heard his presentation, I would very much like to think so, because I think that, as many of us attending today will agree, that the process that he's engaged in is very rich and is also very non-intrusive to young people. But the emphasis of my research with these young men was actually on trust. The whole thing was framed by trust, and this hasn't been the focus specifically of the paper, but it's been implicit to it. It was so hard. That's why I gave the account of this embodied beginning in the studio of us almost, you know, sizing each other up kind of visually and in terms of bodies almost. And I, you know, as I said, I had to respond to physical threats and just sort of face them down. That was kind of par for the course doing that work. So these young men did not want to be on file. That was the whole point. They were, you know, they were attempting to be off file. So I sadly don't have an answer. I guess if I had to offer one, I'm not hopeful, but I would like to think that maybe there'd be a way.
Really, really helpful. Thank you so much. I'm really conscious of time. Thank you for those who've stuck with us. We've run a little bit over 10 minutes over, but I really appreciate everyone's time. Can I say thank you to Simon, to Francis, to Brian, and to everybody in the BEAR office who've helped us run this event. And thank you to everybody who's been with us, who's attended, who's watched. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you maybe later this afternoon and for future Youth SIG events.